just had to work around it. So apologies for that. Crispin.
Yeah, the idea of a divorce dispute being hastened by a grenade, it seems ever more. Thank you, Robin. As Robin said, I'm the director of the Middle East and North Africa group at Eurasia Group. We are political risk consultants, which means nothing really. Political risk can mean, a geologist friend of mine said, you do everything except for the rocks, don't you? And it's everything from, I guess, from a bomb to a ministry bureaucracy malfunctioning. And I'm afraid what I'm going to talk about is probably the less, more to that end of it, the ministry bureaucracy malfunctioning. Robin, can I just... as a gross generalisation, I would say that Iraq has not enough policy and too much politics. And I think oil production policy is a fantastic example of that. You will probably know that as a result of the various licensing rounds and bids, Iraq has a notional production target of 12 million barrels a day by 2017. However, not one single Iraqi designed that number. Iraqi production policy was essentially a good example of passivity in Iraqi politics, where the production number was dictated by oil and gas companies bidding up production targets to a sufficiently large number that the per barrel fee that they were going to get paid by the Iraqi government would reach a rate of return that was acceptable. And I think most oil and gas executives involved in those licensing rounds, if you got them drunk enough or gave them enough sodium pentothal, would agree that deep down the bid parameters were unrealistic, and that they expected at some point for new opportunities to emerge within Iraq, but that they would not ultimately get, sink or swim on the basis of those production targets. Outside the oil and gas companies, when we all saw the numbers, I don't think any of the people that work in my space thought 12 million barrels was remotely possible. Somebody said, I don't think it's possible in West Texas, let alone in Iraq. So I think that where you have to start from is a perspective is what do the Iraqis actually want? What are they prepared to push for? And then even in terms of production, and even then, are they actually capable of meeting their own targets, let alone the targets that ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, CNPC, Lukoil, Total, Petronas, etc., saddled them with. But it's the point of passivity is important here, because having, for my sins, been working in the Middle East since I went to university in Egypt 23 years ago now, so it's more than that, 27 years ago. What I find is in deeply established autocratic states, in Iraq is clearly becoming one of those, in my view. What you tend to find is is an absence of strategic policy, an absence of long-term policy making, a determination to focus on the short term. You could categorise that on the basis that if you are an ex-president of Syria, Egypt, Libya, as has been graphically demonstrated in the last year, your future is not playing golf in Santa Barbara, and therefore you shouldn't focus on 10 years ahead. You should focus on what happens next week, because if there's no next week for you, then nothing else matters. And I think this breeds short-term decision-making, short-term policy-making, and I think Iraq is moving in that direction. And as Nouri al-Maliki, as I think Toby very clearly demonstrated, is moving in that autocratic direction, I envisage Iraq making less and less long-term decisions, more and more focusing on the short term. And this has a distinctly negative impact on the oil and gas sector. If you're not going to look 10 years ahead, you're not going to make the decisions that allow you to create the infrastructure that allows you to create the next piece of infrastructure that allows you to get production levels up to the point that would require you to build the next pipeline that would require you to fill a single point mooring facility at the export point. I would say that there are a large number of factors within Iraq that on a temporary basis also deter decision making, whether they be interministerial combat or competition. It's partly a legacy of distributing power through different political factions currently. It's partly a legacy of the Saddam era. And when you look at the Iraqi government, and say, as Toby pointed out, the Iraqi government has changed at least 3 times since 2003. However, if you go in to sit in a ministry, very often everything up to the deputy ministerial level you're talking to someone who was in the same ministry, in the same seat 10 years ago. And those interministerial conflicts that were fostered under the Saddam era are very often apparent now. So you can get everybody in the oil ministry to agree that they should be doing X. It was impossible to get everybody on the same path from the electricity ministry to agree to do what they need to do to facilitate developments in the oil ministry. So there are those issues. But I think it's really also a question of policy. I think that if I'm going to leave you with anything, I think it would be the inability of an autocratically determined government to make the type of long-term policy decisions that you require to develop the sector in this way. Now, as I said, ambitious targets. That's the top right is a fantastically ambitious target. A fantastically successful pattern of activity in the past 7 years. I mean, look at that. The angle on that production gradient, by any standards, that's impressive. If you draw that number up another 5 years according to the production target, it takes you up to 12 million barrels. Now, this is impressive. 12 million barrels would be astonishing in the time frame they're talking about. And I think the underlying factor here is the inadequacy of policy. Iraq is making progress. The contracts in the south, they are of limited ambition in terms of the Iraqi side. They are difficult to work with. They're quite restrictive in terms of what a company can do. As Toby mentioned, there are lots of difficulties with bureaucracy, but they are facilitating, for example, the creation of export volume growth. So the adding of a single point mooring in March this year adds, in theory, nearly 500,000 barrels of export capacity. That will come online this year. There is a new single point mooring coming on at the beginning of next year. Even if it's delayed, it'll add another 500,000 barrels. So if we say that production at this point is somewhere in the region of around 2.7, something like that, heading upwards as the SPMs come online. This is going backwards. I mean, essentially you have the production at the wellhead and it's being facilitated by latterly adding export volume. At some point in the next year and a half, we'll reach the point where export capacity is higher than wellhead production capacity. And then you have to build wellhead production capacity. I would say that point is going to happen somewhere around 3.8 million barrels a day. So I think the current trajectory of oil production in Iraq moves relatively, I won't say seamlessly, probably in a very jagged, haphazard way, up to around 3.8 million barrels a day by companies doing workovers on existing, partially developed fields or huge, well-developed fields like Rumaila. And then we reach about 3.8 million barrels a day, which is the watershed moment for Iraqi production. And the question there is, how do you get beyond that? The answer is this water injection project that Adrian talked about, which is the driver for long-term major production growth in the big West Ghurna Phase 1, Phase 2 projects, in Majnoon, and actually many of the other fields in that area. That project has barely started. And we are reaching the point where in the next 3 months, unless decisions are made to facilitate the first contracting elements of that project, then Iraq will not be able to drive beyond 3.8 million barrels a day. And the delay you see in those contracting decisions now will be added on to the time frame. And given the lack of progress that we've seen over the last 12 months, I think it would be extremely surprising if the decisions are made to facilitate the SSP, as it's known, are taken this year or perhaps even next year, in which case we're looking at Iraq very much as Michael talked about, security improving to a point and then stagnating. I think that is precisely what we can expect in the oil and gas sector. Production going up to 3.8 million and then stagnating. I would argue that part of this is because, again, that decision to go to 12 million barrels was not taken by any Iraqi. There is no Iraqi official that feels a particular commitment to that. There is also a lack of capacity within the government to pursue decisions and enact the bureaucratic, force the bureaucratic mechanisms to work to facilitate those developments. But fundamentally, it is a lack of commitment to that idea of 12 million barrels as a realistic target. There is no doubt, as Adrian said, there is no doubt of the capacity for Iraq to fill in a big element of the potential supply-demand gap in the next 5 to 10 years. At Eurasia Group, we talk about 4 pillars of global oil production over the next 10 years. Iraq, US tight oil, oil sands and Brazil. And Iraq is a key element of those 4 pillars. It is very difficult, with my experience of working in Iraq on and off, I think I first went to Iraq in 1996, to see the progress being taken, the decisions being taken in this fractured political environment that is going to be focused essentially on redividing the distribution of power and the facilitation of the consolidation of power in Nouri al-Maliki's factions and coalitions of factions, for it to take the long-term strategic decisions it needs to take in order to facilitate this type of growth. So if you look at Iraq in 2006, in the middle of a brutal civil war, and said, well, if by the end of 2014 Iraq was going to be producing nearly 4 million barrels a day, that would have looked like a great outcome. And potentially for the immediate needs of any Iraqi government in the next 2-3 years, that is a great outcome in terms of revenue. And that, again, may be part of the problem, that what is necessary or sufficient to keep the current government in place is not necessary or sufficient to meet global oil demand, or I would argue meet Iraq's potential as an economic actor, quite apart from the fragmentation that implies in terms of the Iraqi domestic political environment. So on that somewhat downbeat note, I am afraid going to jump in a cab and try and repair the damage that is being done to my relationship at this point. But thank you very much for your time this evening.